Welcome back to Web 110 HTML and CSS. In the last video, I talked about the cascade of the cascading style sheets and talked about the different types of CSS. That will make a lot more sense now in this video. In this video, I want to talk about the actual syntax of writing CSS, and I want to do that in conjunction with introducing color at the same time, which is what Chapter 4 does. And first, I wanted to show you a couple of links. Now, last week, under week 2 in the PowerPoint, I briefly went over color. There's a lot more that I could have talked about with color, but I wanted to save that for this video. If you kind of scroll through here with the different links, though, there's this section that says choosing color palettes. And I want to use this time before actually going into the syntax and the code of everything to talk a little bit more about color in general. So this first link, this is looking at, it's called cssdrive.com, and it's a color palette generator. What you do is you upload a picture. From this picture, it generates different color palettes. Now, I think that the colors that are shown here are a little bit too limiting for a color palette, like the light colors. It's fine, that gives you some variation, but I would suggest using something more like the complete color palette, or picking like 1 or 2 colors from each section. So if there's certain colors that you like from each one, it's nice that it gives you a variety, but you wouldn't want to use one of these whole palettes or anything. All right, so this next website, a bunch of ads in the way, sorry. This next website is called Colors on the Web, COTW. So it's colorsontheweb.com. And this one you have to kind of scroll down a little bit. But what it does is it comes up with different color schemes for you based off of a color that you put in here. So right now it's empty, but what you can do is you can type in a color and it puts one in here by default. And it shows these different color schemes. So this is one of the things that I would have liked to talk about a little bit more the other week, but these are different color schemes. You don't necessarily have to memorize all of these, but it is good to be somewhat familiar with these terms, especially because you'll see them when you go to websites like this where it helps you generate these color schemes. So analogous means that the colors are all sort of in the same color family. And there's actually quite a bit of variety in this color, but basically it's this greenish color. And what they've done is they've taken this color of green, and then they have a color that's just a little bit more blue, and then they have a color that's just a little bit more yellow. And then they have what the gray sort of equivalent of that would be if it wasn't completely saturated. So kind of cutting back on that. And then complementary. This comes from the color wheel, and I had a picture of a color wheel in the PowerPoint the other week, and they would be colors that are the complete opposite on the color wheel. So this isn't exactly kind of pure green, but green is on the opposite of red on the color wheel, so they're considered complementary to each other. So they're going to add a lot of contrast from each other. Split complementary, it means that you take 2 colors. So in this case, it's this main color of green and then this version of green that's just a little bit more blue, and it's taking the color that is opposite it and then the color that's opposite of the other one. So you'll notice one of these is just a little bit more blue, one of them is a little bit more yellow, which is causing this to look more pink and this one to look more purple. And then we've also got a gray to match it. Monochromatic is picking one hue, and that's again going back to the color wheel. If you pick one single color on that color wheel, or if you think of a HSL slider where you have all the colors on one slider and you click on one spot, that color is a hue, and then you can take that hue and you can add white or black to it, or you can also take the color out of it. And that's kind of what this is doing, is it's not going a little bit more blue or yellow like the colors here that are analogous, that are kind of a color family where they're really close to each other. This is picking just one exact color of green and it's ramping up the saturation of it, making it more intense, or completely removing the saturation and making it gray. Triadic is taking colors that are evenly split into a triangle basically on your color wheel. So you have 3 colors. So if you think of the primary colors as you would think of them with painting, for example, where you have red, yellow, and blue, those would be triadic. And then tetradic is kind of similar to this split complementary. Depending on what you're using, these might be used a little bit interchangeably. It's basically the idea of having a square on your color wheel where everything is kind of split 4 ways, but it basically counts to a split complementary because you have 2 sets of colors that are complementary to each other by doing that. It just kind of depends on how symmetrical that rectangle is. And then here it has color variation. So this is a good example of like hue variation. So you're changing the hue just a little bit. And then here is looking at saturation variation, which I can barely detect a difference here. It's just very barely changing how saturated it is. And then here we have tint and shade variation. So we can see this a little bit more clearly. So you could use that as an example. This is more of a visual way of looking at the information. I'm always a fan of visuals. And so this is Peloton.com. And you can choose between the different colors. So like here it has monochromatic, so it's just one color. And so all of the colors over here are based off that one hue. And this hue is 0 degrees. And depending on how you are keeping track of your colors, they're going to be written in different ways. And that's another reason why it's kind of beneficial to look at this first before jumping into our code. But we have these different variations of this color. And then what we could do is we could switch the color that we're looking at. In this case, it's all looking at this red. It's just changing the palette to be more saturated or less saturated, and then changing how light or how dark it is. And then here I could choose a different hue. So I could change it from red, maybe change it to blue, and kind of do the same thing. I can change how saturated it is, how unsaturated, how light it is, how dark it is. All right, so these other colors though, here we have an example where we can pick 3 colors that are close to each other. So this is analogous. So it's saying this is our kind of primary color that we're working with, and then we have a secondary color and another secondary color, and they're the colors that are next to each other on this color wheel. So if, for example, we had red, the colors that would be close, and it kind of depends on how much you want to group into this. You could say blue and yellow are the next colors. You could say I'm only going to include basically orange and purple, or you could go even kind of closer and you could say I'm only going to include red, orange, and red, violet in this grouping, but these would all be analogous because they're close to each other, and then you kind of just choose which part of the color wheel that you really want to focus on. And then from there you could also go in and you could choose if you want them to be saturated or not. This is working with the triad where you're working with 3 colors. Now usually they're evenly split. This is kind of more like a split complementary. Split complementary, I'm going to move this so that they're right across from each other. So complementary colors would be like red and green. And then a split complementary is where you kind of step to the side of that color. So having a blue-green and a yellow-green instead of a pure green. That would be split complementary. And then you could just rotate this around. So that way if you have your orange colors, then the split complementary would be a blue purple or a blue green color, and so on and so forth. So you could use that to come up with a palette. Or you could also split these so it's a little bit more symmetrical where we have, let me try to put this more on our primary color. So we've got more yellow, red, blue colors. And then here we have our tetrad, so 4 colors. And this is where I was saying that they can be kind of more like a long rectangle, or you can kind of try to make it evenly divide into 4, but it basically turns into 2 complementary sets because there's always going to be 2 across from each other, no matter if some of them are closer or not. So this is a really handy color chart. If you hover over these colors, it'll tell you the hexadecimal value. That's something I haven't explained to you yet, but maybe you're familiar with that term already. Now this is actually one of my favorites, and this is color.adobe.com, and there's actually some other Adobe websites that are really helpful. There's I don't remember what it is. I want to say probably fonts.adobe, where you can see different types of font that Adobe supports. You can see the colors, and it'll tell you the hexadecimal values. It shows you the RGB values, and then you can also change the color mode. Now this is what's called color modes. In the PowerPoint I had, there was a list of these two, where there's RGB, which is when you're looking at screens, you split the colors into red, green, and blue, and you have different values for each one. So in order to get the color that we want here, for example, we're saying how much of the red do we want? Do we want none of the red, or do we want all of the red? And then same thing with our green. Do we want all of the green, or do we want none of the green? Sorry, it should be the other way around. And then blue, do we want none of the blue or all of the blue? And so if we have absolutely all red, green, and blue, we should have white. If we have none of these, we'll have black. And then this last part is going to control how light or dark it is. And then we have our HSB. HSL and HSB are basically interchangeable. The B and the L stand for brightness or lightness, depending on what you're using. So in this case, B is for brightness, but we choose the hue. So the hue is the color on our color wheel. So whichever color that might be, it could be like a green. And then we have our saturation. How intense is this green? Is it a very intense green, or if we take all the color out, it turns gray? And then here we have the brightness. How much white gets added, how much black gets added to it. And then we have a few other ones, like if you were talking about printing, you would use CMYK, but you're mostly going to be using, and then there are hexadecimal values, which these hexadecimal values, they basically stand for our RGB. So if I switch this back to RGB, this might help a little bit. So you have the first two stand for the red value, the second set stand for the green value, and then the last set stands for the blue value. So I could go in here and I could type in FF, and it's going to turn it red. And you'll get more familiar with these. This is why I wanted to show you the link that I have for this week, because it tells you what these hexadecimal values are. You basically have the numbers from 0 to 9, and then the alphabet from A to F. Those in combination will choose your color. So you can kind of see here, 0 is it means that there is none of that value. There's absolutely none of it. Versus if you have F is going to be the last value out of your hexadecimal values, and so it means you have all of it. And you can see on RGB, having the most is out of 255, having none is going to be 0. So I could say I want no red, and then I want all of the second value, so it's going to be all green, no blue, and no red. And here I could switch it and I could say, okay, I want all the green and all the blue, and so it's going to mix together to make kind of this cyan color. So once you get kind of the feel for RGB, even if you don't like writing out your styles in RGB, it will help you kind of with guessing what your hexadecimal colors would be. So for example, we know that all zeros gave us black. And then now if we have all Fs, that's going to give us white. And then if we wanted to try something in the middle, let's do all Bs. So now we have a gray color. If you wanted the gray to be maybe a little bit more blue or a little bit less, you could go and you could change the value. Now, I'm not as familiar with hexadecimal as I am with RGB, and so it's a little hard for me to kind of guess what these colors would be, but that's where that link is going to be helpful. So you can kind of play around with that, or you can use a website like this, which makes it really easy because you can just click on these sliders and move them around and pick the color you want, and then it'll tell you exactly what that hexadecimal value is. So anyways, we've got analogous. So those are going to be colors where it's going to be ones that are close to each other. This is nice though because it gives you a little bit more control over kind of clicking on these here and then adjusting them over here. We've got monochromatic, so you'll notice they're all in line with the same hue. Triad is splitting amongst three. Complementary is across from each other. Split complementary moves two of them to the side from across. Double split complementary, square, compound, and then different shades. And then you can also do custom. Now there's some other interesting things that they've added a little bit. I want to do accessibility tools because I think this is really helpful. You can check to see how good the contrast is with certain colors. So this did 2 colors by its own. It just kind of did it by default, but you can import your colors to check. And then you can kind of check to see if, like here it's saying by making this too light, now it's failing if the text is at this size or smaller. And then it's also failing at this size and this size. So it has some suggestions. It's saying you could make the kind of, I call that kind of a teal color. It's a really dark one though. You can take kind of this bluish green color and you can make it a lot darker. You could make the pink color a lot lighter. And thinking about how you could work with the text to make everything stand out, and even kind of showing this icon of what would be the text or not. And then there's this other ability to check the colorblind safety of some colors. So we could take, let's see first if I can do complementary. We'll see if it remembers it. So we have, okay, so looking at the 3 different versions of color blindness, we can see what our color palette would look like to somebody who has these. And so you could see, you know, at least as far as these colors are, they would be difficult, and I think they're difficult anyways. Like these colors are way too close to each other. You would maybe want to use one instead of the other, but you wouldn't want to use them on each other. That's where you could check the contrast anyways. But if we were to perhaps move these more across from each other, we might encounter issues where they just start looking really similar to each other and they don't necessarily stand out. So down here, they're standing out quite a bit, but here they look very similar to each other. So what you can do though, is you can find different ways of creating a lot of contrast. Like this color is a lot darker than these colors over here. So you might really want to encourage your color palette to have some really dark values and some really light values. And then try to put some of these in slightly different spots. So that way you can create quite a bit of contrast in multiple ways. And then also trying to keep things simple, where if you use color, maybe use color with white, or use color with black, or use color with gray, so that way you don't just have color on color. And then you can also think about what sort of font choices are you using to make that color easier to look at. So this is going to be really helpful. I've had students before who are colorblind, and they also would ask questions like, am I doomed to just not be able to work with color and color palettes? And that's where I think some of these tools can be really helpful as well, where you might have a hard time choosing color palettes, but you could modify the color palettes or be able to work with what already exists. And that's where, like, if you found a picture that you think works really well and it's something like a picture of nature, you know, it's probably going to look nice together because it's going to seem very natural and people are going to be drawn to it. So if you find a picture that you like, you could go and you could take colors out of it and you could use the generator to help you with that. And then something that I really like too is with this website, you can explore different color palettes other people have come up with. And usually what happens is you get whatever the colors for the year are kind of come up first. So that's why so many of these look the same. But then once you go onto about the second page, you start to see a lot of different color palettes people have put together. And you could use these as a starting point and you can actually modify them. Same thing, there's a lot of other good websites, like you could go to Pinterest or something. So I could click on this and then we have option like add to library, download it, create using themes. So I could click on this and then maybe looking at this, I might think, you know, I like the variety, like I like that there's these darker colors, but maybe one of these could actually be quite darker. And then maybe you want one to kind of be a little bit more saturated so it stands out a little bit. So you could kind of tweak them from what you find, but that would give you kind of a good starting point. And you can see like different trends and everything that as well. So Adobe's color website, I really like quite a bit. So you'll be able to find those all under week 2 under the color section. And then as far as week 3 goes, that's where I have this WebSafe color chart. And this tells you the hexadecimal values and then the RGB equivalent. So that can help you a lot where if you were trying to figure out like, how do I actually write red? It'll show you how to write that here. Or if you're trying to pick a particular color, it's got all of those. And then an additional way that you can write color is so long as it's kind of more of a simple color, you're not going to be able to find every single one, but a lot of colors actually have been defined already. They tend to be the ones that are web safe. And so you could actually type in, like for example, blue, and it's going to know that blue has this hexadecimal color. You shouldn't have an issue with colors like blue, but if you were to pick one of these like cornflower blue, you might have a harder time getting that to show the same in every single browser. So I would suggest using hexadecimal. I think hexadecimal values is probably the best way of being able to write your colors for web. Now I'm biased with, I personally like to use RGB because I do a lot of photo and video editing. And that's going to be what I encounter the most when I'm working with Adobe software. But for web, hexadecimal is going to be your best bet. All right, so now let's actually get into how to actually write it. And I'm actually going to start here with these notes that I've been typing up. So CSS has style rules, and you start off with your selector. And then you have a declaration. So you select the element ID class, and that will make more sense. We'll talk about IDs and classes and what those are, but you select the thing that you want to style, and then you declare something about it. And the declaration is broken into 2 parts. There is the property and the value that you want to set that property to. So pretty straightforward. So let's say that we want to style a paragraph. we would write P for paragraph. So it's however it would be written in your tags. So we have P just outside of the tags. And then that is going to go first. So that's our selector. And actually, let me write it first. So we have our selector. And you want to make sure it's lowercase. So we have selector. And then in curly brackets, we're going to say our property. And then we're going to have colon. And then we're going to say value, semicolon, to terminate that. And then we are going to close it. So example would be paragraph. And then I could say, I want to change the color. And I want to change it to red. And then you can actually specify quite a bit of things about your selector. So let's say you have more things that you want to all share the same declaration. So I could say I want my H1, my H2, and my H3, and you split them with commas. You say I want all of those to have a color of blue. So that's how you would write that. Or you could say, I want the, let's say paragraph to have a color of red, and then I want the background color to be white. So this is allowing you to have multiple statements all within the same set of styles. And this is where we use a lot of tabbing to make things a little bit more organized. So something like this, I would actually put my curly brackets over top of each other, and then I would kind of list things out. So I could say I want the color to be red, I want background color to be white. These are pretty straightforward as far as our properties go. And this is where I want to introduce our actual properties. So there is the color property, and it lets you set colors for text. I wish it was called text color, because I think a lot of times it gets a little confusing, because background color does exactly what you would think. It styles the background's color, but color is going to set the color of the text. And as I've been talking about, there's different ways to write that. So you could say, I want the color to be red, and that's going to be recognized. Most browsers are going to be able to recognize that color. We could also say, I want the color to be RGB. And then you would say how many, or what the value is for each. So you do RGB, parentheses, and you have to have no spaces between it. And you say how much. So if it's red, we would say, I want all of the red, none of the green, none of the blue, separated by parentheses. And then you would terminate that with the semicolon. And we could say, I want the color to be HSL. And in this case, we'd choose the hue. Now on the hue, like the color wheel, red is the starting place. So it is 0. So it's 0 degrees. And then the values for HSL are percentages. So if we want, the next one would be saturation level. So for that pure red color, that's going to be 100% saturation. And then if we want it to be red for the lightness, 100% or 0% lightness, that's going to be completely white or black. So if we want it to be right in the middle, you would actually pick 50%, and then we would terminate that. And then we also have our hexadecimal value, which we start with a number sign, or you might think of that as hashtag. And then this is where you just have to kind of get used to our values, where we have red comes first. So F is going to be the largest value, and then 0 is none for the green, and then 0 for the blue. Now you can also write that as, if you've got every one is paired, like we've got 2 Fs, 2 zeros, 2 zeros, you can actually abbreviate that to F00. And you can also write in uppercase. So there's a couple of ways to do your hexadecimal, but that's going to be the color property. And then the background color property, it just sets the background color for the HTML element that you are choosing basically, and it's just written as background color with a hyphen, and then you would just choose whatever color that would be. All right, so now that we have all of this, we can actually start implementing this in an example in our code. And for the sake of brevity, I think I'm going to split this. We'll keep these notes to reference for the next video, but I'm going to actually split this so that way putting that into a video file, it'll be separate. So this will just kind of stay working with the rules and the syntax, and then we'll actually jump into writing it. All right, so if you've got any questions, feel free to leave a comment on the discussion or send me an email.